World of Warfare presents Bombing Dresden. By February of 1945, the dwindling armies of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany were collapsing on every front, while much of Europe now stood in a state of devastation and ruin. To the east, the Red Army had smashed through Poland and stood less than 70 miles from the German capital of Berlin, while on the Western Front, Allied forces had broken through the Ardennes after the failure of Hitler's last offensive gamble at the Battle of the Bulge. And while Hitler would not admit to it yet, his Third Reich had been mortally wounded, both by Germany's debilitating loss of experienced and able-bodied manpower and the Allies' ever-accelerating strategic bombing campaign, which now witnessed heavy bomber streams of up to 1,000 aircraft that decimated both German cities and the Nazis' ability to replenish destroyed weapons of war. Yet as Germany crumbled and Hitler spiraled out of control amidst a fog of accelerating drug use and mental instability, he refused to give up the fight for what many in his own German high command now saw as a lost cause. Hitler's obstinacy would prove devastating for the ancient Saxon capital of Dresden in the valley of the River Elbe, where its centuries-old Baroque architecture, fine art, and cultural refinements made it known as the Florence on the Elbe, a city whose history dated as far back as the early 1200s. By early 1945, however, the city had swollen beyond capacity as refugees fleeing the Red Army's advance through East Prussia, Schlesien, and Pommern poured into Dresden by the tens of thousands each day, choking railway stations and public buildings, forcing refugees to sleep in corridors, cellars, and even the street. Many Dresden residents believed that they would be spared the Allies' ever-increasing bombing campaigns aimed at German cities, believing falsely that their cultural centerpiece city would face nothing like the bloody campaigns against Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, an assumption that would soon prove patently naive. Throughout the early years of war in Europe, the British Royal Air Force Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, had pursued a doctrine of strategic area bombing by night, with the objective of destroying Germany's industrial cities in an effort to break the Nazis' manufacturing capacity, at the same time inflicting heavy losses to civilian populations with the goal of forcing them to rebel against their own government until it was forced to capitulate and sue for peace. The U.S. Army Air Force, on the other hand, led in the ETO by General Karl Toohey Spaatz, had emphasized daylight precision bombing thanks to the Norden bomb site, focusing instead on ball-bearing plants, an essential component of mechanized warfare, synthetic and non-synthetic oil refineries, as well as transportation hubs. Yet as the war in Europe dragged on, the distinction between Allied targets and practices began to blur, which soon placed Dresden in the Allies' crosshairs. In January of 1945, the Soviets launched their Vistula-Oder offensive at breakneck speed, forcing German troops to fall back in chaos as they continued to move reinforcements in by rail. The next month at the Yalta Conference, which brought the Big Three Allied war leaders together to discuss post-war reconstruction plans for war-torn European nations, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin and his representatives demanded a sharp acceleration in Allied bombing campaigns against transport hubs behind German lines, intended to disrupt German troop movements toward the Eastern Front. After the conference, Allied war leaders identified Dresden as a major rail nexus within Germany, connecting Berlin to Prague, Vienna, Munich, and the Eastern Territories, further pinpointing the city as home to one of the largest marshalling yards in Eastern or Central Germany. British planning documents describe Dresden as an unbombed built-up area of considerable importance to the enemy, while RAF Target Committee notes pointed to its robust industrial output within the city, including optical instruments, precision engineering, and armaments components. given its new strategic importance. On February 8 of 1945, RAF Bomber Command issued operational instructions for the Allies' day and night raids on the city. Codenamed Operation Thunderclap, the objective was to shatter communications in and around Dresden, overwhelm the city's rescue capacity, and create maximum dislocation of both ordinary citizens and Germany's ability to supply the Eastern Front with both men and weapons. Accordingly, at 21:51 hours on February 13th, air raid sirens wailed across Dresden, and while many residents had heard the alarms before, some responded mechanically, while still others hesitated to their own detriment. Approaching the city was a massive bomber stream made up of some 800 Avro Lancasters and de Havilland Mosquitoes, meticulously choreographed in waves of attack boxes. In the first wave of 244 Lancasters, lead Pathfinder radar-equipped aircraft dropped magnesium flares known as Christmas trees over the city center, bathing Dresden in an eerie white glow, before the bomber stream that followed dropped their payloads of high-explosive bombs on their targets. The subsequent explosions opened rooftops and shattered windows, rupturing water mains and exposing wooden interiors. Within minutes, fires ignited across the Altstadt, or historic Old Town district of the city. After the first wave withdrew at 22:14 hours, an intermediate wave of bombers delivered the incendiary phase, where hundreds of thousands of small magnesium and phosphorus bombs penetrated attics before bursting into blinding white flames in excess of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, leading Jewish scholar and Dresden survivor Victor Klemperer to write in his diary, "The sky was one single flare. The city was like a crater of flames." After midnight, the last wave of 529 Lancasters approached the city, which by now saw hundreds of individual fires merged into one, creating a vacuum effect when cooler air rushed inward along the ground, which then accelerated into a firestorm of hurricane-strength winds. Last witnessed in Hamburg in July of 1943, an event responsible for 40,000 civilian deaths, Margaret Fryer was a young woman when the firestorm swept through Dresden, later writing that the air was pulling us, it felt alive. We could not stand upright. The wind drove us toward the flames. Other survivors described streets that turned into wind tunnels of fire, while temperatures in some places soared above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees exploded, asphalt liquefied, while overcrowded cellars were deprived of oxygen that was consumed by the combustion above. It was like stepping into the mouth of a furnace, Lothar Metzger recalled during a brief emergence from a shelter. The sky was red, not dark, but red. People attempted to reach the River Elbe to escape the flames, only to die of exhaustion or lack of oxygen on their way, or in the river itself after hypothermia set in. Others were suffocated by toxic gases or torched alive by wind-driven flames. The famous Frauenkirche's sandstone dome glowed a deep crimson, and by 0200 hours on Valentine's Day, February 14th, the entire city center had been turned to skeletal ash. By sunrise, the devastation was beyond comprehension, only to turn even more nightmarish when at 12:17 hours, formations of American B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force appeared in the skies over Dresden. Visibility over Dresden marshalling yards and industrial facilities was badly limited due to the smoke from the previous night's firestorm, forcing bombardiers to rely on radar and visual breaks in the haze to attempt frequently inaccurate drops on their target objectives. 1,800 tons of bombs were dropped on the city, just as dazed survivors emerged from shelters in search of friends and family members, only to have their illusions that the worst was behind them shattered in a fresh wave of destruction. "We thought morning meant survival," one woman later recalled. Then the sirens screamed again. Bombers from the American 8th returned on the following day with an objective of finishing off transportation hubs. Yet by then, much of the city center and its infrastructure had already been destroyed. Operation reports from RAF Bomber Command described the attack as an exceptionally successful raid, with both excellent concentration and marking, while American aircrew debriefings reported fires well established and heavy smoke to 15,000 feet. "We saw the glow long before we reached the target," one Lancaster navigator later recalled. "It filled the horizon." Captured during the Battle of the Bulge, future novelist Kurt Vonnegut had been relocated as a POW to Dresden shortly before the bombing. The boxcar doors were opened, he recalled, and the doorways framed the loveliest city that most Americans had ever seen. Housed in a slaughterhouse, Vonnegut wrote out the days of bombing in the relative safety of a meat locker, and when his guards finally allowed the prisoners outside after the first wave of bombings, Dresden was like the moon now, he later wrote in his novel Slaughterhouse-Five. Nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. Because of the immense success of Slaughterhouse-Five, Vonnegut later commented in an interview that he was the only survivor of Dresden who ever made money from the destruction of the city. While initial death toll estimates rose as high as 200,000 dead, as Nazi apologist David Irving claimed in his 1963 book The Destruction of Dresden, a figure long accepted by early war historians. Critics eventually pounced on Irving's lack of evidence and his complete refusal to acknowledge the estimated 6 million people killed in the Holocaust. Years later, Irving gained notoriety as a Holocaust denier, which resulted in his criminal conviction in 2006. In an attempt to silence right-wing ideologues from exploiting the death toll, in 2004, the city of Dresden established a historical commission to produce more precise data using historical, military, forensic, and archaeological research, publishing revised estimates in 2010 of 22,700 to 25,000 dead. After the bombing, the cultural destruction of the city's landmarks was complete and horrifying. The Frauenkirche burned for 2 days before collapsing on February 15th, deliberately left as a blackened shell in East Germany after the war as a memorial to the dead. The Zwinger Palace was heavily damaged, while the Semperoper Opera House was completely gutted. Much of the city's art treasures, thankfully, had been evacuated in advance of the city's destruction, temporarily housed in tunnels and mines outside the city. Incinerated, unrecognizable bodies littered the streets of the city center, while mass cremations of others was conducted in the Altmark Square. One survivor, Ursula Mallendorf, later recalled searching for her parents. "There was no street left, no house, only rubble and smoke. It was then that I realized they were gone." While historians have debated the necessity or morality of the bombings, for the survivors, strategic arguments meant little in the face of their losses. The worst was the silence afterward, one survivor recalled. No birds, no traffic, just ruins. Another remembered the smell, which lingered over the destroyed city for weeks, made worse by the rot of buried corpses. "Dresden has ceased to exist," wrote Victor Klemperer. "Those who have unlearned how to cry," wrote German writer Gerhard Hauptmann, "will learn it afresh on the destruction of Dresden."